Voters are hitting the polls for Super Tuesday, the biggest day of the presidential primary season so far. Republicans are holding nominating contests in 15 states and Democrats in 15 states and one territory. President Biden, of course, secured overwhelming support from black voters back in 2020, but new polling shows that backing could be declining. The recent New York Times Siena poll shows 23% support among black voters for former President Trump. That's up 19 points since a similar poll just before the 2020 election. A new article from Baratunde Thurston, a writer for Puck News and host of the How to Citizen podcast, outlines a shift for enthusiasm for President Biden among black voters, and he joins us now to break down the dilemma. Baratunde, I read you religiously at Puck. Break down to our viewers. I mean, on one hand, they hear former President Trump suggesting that because he's been indicted all these times and has a mugshot and also has now, sneakers, that's going to gain him traction with African-American voters.
Good sneakers traction?
Oh, I didn't even see that I was doing that. Very good. But help me understand what's driving this shift in support for President Biden to Donald Trump.
Thanks, Vlad and Marie, for having me. Happy Super Tuesday, and I hope everybody who can will go out and vote in this election. It is not the sneakers. It is not the shoes. And I think it is important to emphasize, as Pastor Michael McBride, who I interviewed for this piece, said, Trump's life is not available to you, bro. Like, we can't be out here, no matter how fly our sneakers are, with 91 counts against us, hosting rallies and pursuing the presidency of the United States. There's definitely a double standard there. But what I found is that there are 3 or 4 parts of the puzzle. The overall, we got to understand, is a game of margins. There's not a huge Blexit of black people exiting the Democratic Party. But when elections come down to tens of thousands of votes in a handful of states, every vote counts. And there are some that are not willing to be counted for Joe Biden. For instance, there are issues of concern about the economy, justice agenda, and basically promises made that haven't been fully delivered on. There's challenges with how this administration has supported Israel in its bombardment and invasion in response to the Hamas October 7th attack in Gaza. And there's a failure of this idea of saving democracy not being tangible for so many people on the ground who don't experience democracy. That kind of message doesn't fully resonate with enough people. So we're starting to see some of his numbers slip from 91% in the last election down to as low as 75%. Again, massive majority, but margins count.
That is really, really fascinating. You've seen with his campaign, it really did kind of start with this defender of democracy narrative, and then they've started to change that dialogue as maybe they're realizing that it's just not hitting people. You brought up something else, though, the conflict in the Middle East. One of the things that we have been seeing are black pastors, black churches organizing in support of Palestinians. Is that having an impact on Biden's support among black voters?
I am sure it is having an impact. And I want to be so holistic in my representation of what I think is going on here. This is not simply a case of black Americans or black voters choosing a side over another side, but there is a flagrant humanitarian crisis playing out. There are orders of magnitude, massive amounts of death, of starvation, of siege that are playing out, and an administration which was very slow to call for any sort of humanitarian pause, humanitarian corridors, in this conflict. And these pastors, one of whom I spoke to, are feeling this from not just their parishioners, but their community and their constituents. There is, as one of them put it to me, a moral conundrum here. And there's a level of frustration that so much U.S. money and U.S. weaponry, so essentially in our names, is going to what's playing out on everybody's screens and everybody's pockets and everybody's phones. So there was a deep sense of catastrophe playing out, not only from afar, but that we are playing a role in. And that is a very hard pill for some people to swallow, even as they also stand with a lot of the alliances we have experienced with the Jewish community here in this country.
But Baratunde, help me understand then, is there a sense that you will not vote, a voter who feels this way will not vote for President Biden Or perhaps not even vote for President Trump, but it doesn't strike me that there's nothing in Donald Trump's past that has suggested that he is a friend of the Palestinian cause. If anything, it's been the opposite. Donald Trump, with a return to the Oval Office, would be potentially catastrophic. It's already catastrophic for Palestinians in Gaza, but I can't even imagine what it would look like, in terms of his policy and in terms of his rapprochement to Bibi Netanyahu. So help me understand that. And then, you write in your piece that the saving democracy feels short-sighted to you, but for some people, that is rather important of a message in the here and the now.
Yeah, now I want to clarify my points about democracy. I totally am down with saving democracy. I'm down with the idea of all of us embodying and practicing democracy. I'm also down with being realistic about how messages land in people's communities and in people's bodies. And it's very hard to get people to rally around the idea of democracy when some of them haven't had their voting rights restored and don't have literal access to it in the form of the ballot box, or when the promises of democracy don't bear fruit in people's daily lives. And so we have to meet people where they are and not browbeat and shame and push people through fear into voting, but invite them in to participate in shaping the system through people power, which is what the whole project here in America is about. As far as the situation in Gaza, there is not a simple action that I see happening of Black people saying, I'm upset with Biden over this, therefore I'm going to vote for Trump. That's a big leap. I am upset with this administration over this, and I need to register my discontent because their actions have not fallen in line with the majority of the people in the Democratic Party, and in some measures, the people of the country, to try to rein in some of what we're seeing play out on our screens. And so people are taking their opportunity, especially in a primary, which is where some of these disagreements play out. We've seen this happen time and again on a number of issues. What happens in November is yet to be seen. I am sure some of these folks want there to be a more significant policy change. I'm sure some of them may not vote at all or may vote for a third party. I'm sure the vast majority are not going to flip from Biden to Trump over this issue. I don't think people are that short-sighted or that unclear in their thinking, but they're looking for some outlet to express what is playing out before them and strikes them as very morally challenged. And I think on the economic argument, if you're in a community that hasn't received resources, that is being reflected back in a tough on crime language from the 90s, and you see a surge of financial resources in a war, but you don't see a surge in your own community, which sometimes feels like it's at war, then that's a sense of disconnect, as Pastor Mike told me, a sense of dissonance. And so how the Biden campaign and the Biden administration respond to that sense of dissonance, they have opportunities to do that. And part of it is not gaslighting people about their sense of morality or their sense of disconnect, but meeting them where they are, acknowledging it, and trying to more deeply and honestly engage.
All right, that's fascinating. God, I have like 4 more questions, but we're out of time.
Me too. You got to come back,
yeah,
man.
Definitely.
Yeah, you got to come back.
Baratunde Thurston, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.